as if confiding in the listener. June 4th, 1943. Railroad Street, Mejia, Texas. The pencil trembled just a little as Una Fitzia Vera Burkhart pressed it against paper, writing quietly in his hidden diary. Every word he penned could have sent him to solitary confinement, if discovered by his officers. He thought, the Americans must be lying to us. No nation could possess such. Through the train window, his eyes had just witnessed something that tore apart 3 years of Nazi propaganda. Electric lights blazing from every farmhouse, every street corner, every shop window. An endless constellation of electricity stretching across the Texas plains. At 10 o'clock at night. In Germany, blackout regulations had plunged the Reich into darkness since 1940. Even before the war, rural electrification had reached barely 20% of German farms. Yet here, in what Nazi propaganda had described as a decadent, collapsed America, electricity flowed like water. 1,850 veterans of Irwin RML's Afrika Korps stepped down from the passenger train. Not cattle cars, not freight wagons, but cushioned Pullman coaches, with dining services, sleeping berths. The entire population of Mejia had turned out to witness their arrival. What none of them knew was that this moment would trigger the most profound psychological transformation in modern history. A systematic demolition of Nazi ideology through the sheer display of American industrial capacity. The mathematics of Allied victory were being written, not in battle plans, but in production statistics that would soon shatter every assumption these soldiers carried about their enemies, their homeland, and their cause. The collapse had begun on May 13th, 1943, in Tunisia. General Jürgen von Arnim, RML's replacement, surrendered, along with approximately 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian soldiers. The numbers varied as scattered units continued surrendering over several days. The Wehrmacht's most experienced desert fighters, men who had driven the British back to Egypt, who had earned the grudging respect of Montgomery himself, were suddenly prisoners. First class, veteran of the France campaign, wounded twice in North Africa. His diary, discovered decades later in the National Archives, would provide historians with the most detailed account of the psychological impact of American captivity on German soldiers. The journey from defeat to revelation began in the port of Oran, Algeria, as Radka and 30,000 other prisoners waited in makeshift camps for transport ships. American efficiency was already beginning to crack their preconceptions. The U.S. Army processed thousands of prisoners daily, with an organizational precision that exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had achieved, even at the height of its power. Identity cards photographed and filed, medical examinations completed, inoculations administered, Geneva Convention rights explained in fluent German by American officers trained specifically for this moment. But the first real shock came with the food. Oberreiter Hans Mohr, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, wrote to his mother 8 months later, "In the cage at Oran, while we waited for ships, The Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of desert warfare. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. We thought it was propaganda, that they were trying to impress us. We didn't realize this was their standard military ration. The Liberty ships that would carry them across the Atlantic were themselves monuments to American industrial capacity. The SS Robert E. Peary had been built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California, a fact that would have been dismissed as impossible propaganda if the Germans had known it. These vessels, produced at a rate of 3 per day at the peak of production, were returning from delivering supplies to the European theater. Rather than sail back empty, they carried human cargo, up to 30,000 prisoners per month by summer 1943. The 2-week Atlantic crossing in July 1943 provided the second phase of psychological demolition. Feld Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept a detailed account that survived in letters to his family after repatriation with disbelief. The ship's crew, he noted, disposed of more food waste each day than his entire company had received in weekly rations during the final months in Africa. The American sailors threw away half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, gallons of milk that had sat too long, Zimmermann wrote. They did this openly, without thought, not to mock them, but because, to them, this waste meant nothing. Their supply was limitless. The ships themselves became floating classrooms in American power. Prisoners discovered that the vessel carrying them was one of 2,710 Liberty ships that would be built during the war, each one requiring 250,000 parts assembled from components manufactured in 32 states. The engines, they learned from talkative American guards, were built in 3 separate factories, each producing 900 horsepower cylinders that were then assembled in ports that had barely existed 2 years earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, whose aristocratic Prussian family had served in every German war since Frederick the Great, would later write in his memoirs, "As our ship approached the American coast, I watched the radar antenna rotating above the bridge. This technology, which we believed only we and perhaps the British possessed in limited quantities, was standard equipment on a cargo vessel. It was then I first suspected that Germany had already lost the war." August 2nd, 1943. Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The first sight of America shattered the last remnants of Nazi propaganda about American industrial weakness. The engines, they learned from talkative American guards, were built in 3 separate factories, each producing 900 horsepower cylinders that were then assembled in ports that had barely existed 2 years earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, whose aristocratic Prussian family had served in every German war since Frederick the Great, would later write in his memoirs, "As our ship approached the American coast, I watched the radar antenna rotating above the bridge. This technology, which we believed only we and perhaps the British possessed in limited quantities, was standard equipment on a cargo vessel. It was then I first suspected that Germany had already lost the war." August 2nd, 1943. Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The first sight of America shattered the last remnants of Nazi propaganda about American industrial weakness. The Norfolk base sprawled across 4,300 acres, its docks stretching for miles, its cranes loading and unloading dozens of ships simultaneously. In a single day, this one port handled more tonnage than the entire German port of Hamburg managed in a week. Gerrit Johann Huber, a factory worker from the Ruhr before his conscription, counted 47 cargo ships in various stages of loading or unloading. Each crane, he noted in his secret diary, lifted loads that would have required a dozen men and horses in Germany. They moved with electric power, smoothly, continuously, without the coal smoke that choked their industrial cities. The prisoners were formed into columns for the march to the waiting trains. Along the route, they passed parking lots filled with civilian automobiles, hundreds of them belonging to dock workers. In Germany, private automobile ownership remained a privilege of the wealthy and the party elite. The Volkswagen, promised to the German people since 1934, remained a propaganda dream, with fewer than 1,000 ever delivered to civilians. Here, ordinary laborers drove to work in their own cars. But nothing prepared them for the trains themselves, not boxcars, not the 40-and-8 wagons, 40 men or 8 horses that had carried German troops across Europe, but full passenger coaches, Pullman cars, with padded seats that converted to sleeping berths, dining cars with white tablecloths and silver cutlery, observation cars with panoramic windows. Hedman Radke wrote, "We boarded like tourists, not prisoners. The American guards seemed almost embarrassed by the comfort. One sergeant apologized that the air conditioning wasn't working properly in our car. Air conditioning? In August? They had believed such luxury existed only in Hitler's personal train. The 3-day train journey from Norfolk to the camps of Texas and Oklahoma would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any military defeat. As the trains rolled through Virginia, the prisoners pressed their faces against windows, witnessing an America that couldn't exist according to everything they had been told. With wonder, every small town blazed with illumination. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, communities that in Germany would have been lucky to have a single electric street lamp, displayed illuminated shop windows, electric signs, houses with lights burning in multiple rooms. The trains passed factories running night shifts, their windows glowing, parking lots full even at midnight. Obergreiter Muir, whose father had been a Nazi party block leader in Hamburg, wrote in a letter discovered in 1987, "We passed through dozens of cities that first night. Everyone had more electricity than all of Hamburg. The guards told us this was normal, that every American town had electricity since the 1920s. I called him a liar. He just shrugged and said we would see." In Roanoke, Virginia, the train stopped for water and coal. The prisoners watched as American railway workers performed in 30 minutes what would have taken 2 hours in Germany. Automated coal loaders, electric water pumps, mechanized lubrication systems. Every aspect of the operation demonstrated technological superiority. With subtle disbelief, more disturbing still was the casual wealth of the workers themselves. They wore leather boots that would have cost a German laborer 2 months' wages. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles and threw the empties into bins without thought. They smoked cigarettes continuously, stubbing them out half-finished. Oberreiter Hinrich Müller, an electrical engineer from Siemens before the war, calculated that the single railway yard they stopped in used more electricity in 1 hour than his entire district in Berlin used in a day. "The waste was magnificent," he wrote. "They left lights burning in empty buildings. Electric fans ran in vacant rooms. It was the carelessness of infinite resource." With deliberate pace, as the trains crossed into Tennessee and Kentucky, the prisoners encountered American industrial power in full display. Through the windows, they watched endless factories, each one larger than anything most had seen in Germany. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee stretched for 3 miles along the river, its electric furnaces consuming 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the entire city of Munich, near Louisville. The train slowed as they passed the Rubbertown complex, where synthetic rubber plants had sprung from empty fields in just 18 months. 4 massive facilities, each employing thousands of workers, producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually. Germany, despite inventing the process, had never managed more than 120,000 tons in its best year. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, understood the implications immediately. In a post-war interview, he recalled, "I knew those plants. I could see the distillation columns, the catalytic crackers. Each facility was more advanced than anything we had built, and there were 4 of them just in this one location. They told us there were dozens more across the country." The trains passed Ford's Willow Run plant outside Detroit, visible from miles away. This single factory, built in just 9 months, produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At peak production, 42,000 workers assembled bombers from 1,550,000 parts, manufactured by 1,500 subcontractors. The plant consumed 2.5 million square feet of floor space and used more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne. Hedman Verley, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face against the window as they passed. He counted 17 B-24s in various stages of completion visible from the train. We had been told American planes were inferior, hastily built, would fall apart in combat. But I could see the precision of the assembly lines, the quality of the construction. These were not inferior aircraft. They were simply built faster than we could imagine. The deeper the trains penetrated into America, the more complete became the destruction of Nazi mythology. In St. Louis, they crossed the Mississippi River on the Eads Bridge, while below them, barges carried more grain than the entire German harvest of 1942. The prisoners could see grain elevators stretching along both banks, each one holding enough wheat to feed a German city for months. Unratia Karl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, wrote in his diary, "The Americans transport food as we transport ammunition, in endless quantities without concern for loss. I watched them loading a single barge with enough wheat to feed my entire village for 5 years. The crane operator was eating a sandwich with meat thicker than our weekly ration." In Kansas City, the train stopped at a massive stockyard where tens of thousands of cattle waited for slaughter. The smell of meatpacking plants filled the air for miles. German prisoners who had subsisted on 200 grams of meat per week in Africa, when lucky, watched American workers eating beef sandwiches during their lunch break. "They ate meat like we ate bread," wrote Gefreiter Paul Fischer. No, that's wrong. They ate meat like we wished we could eat bread. The guard bought them hamburgers from a stand near the station. Meat, cheese, vegetables on white bread for 15 cents. He bought 20 of them without thinking, paid with a single dollar bill. This was not special. This was their normal food. The arrival at the camps themselves provided the next level of cognitive demolition. Camp Hearn, Texas, built in just 4 months, housed between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners, in conditions that exceeded what most had known as civilians. Wooden barracks, with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heat. Each building, constructed with more lumber than entire German villages possessed. The camp hospital astounded the medical personnel among the prisoners. Oberst, Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself in a facility better equipped than most German civilian hospitals. X-ray machines, surgical equipment, pharmaceutical supplies that had been unavailable in Germany since 1941. All standard provision for enemy prisoners. They had penicillin, Dr. Bauer would later testify. This miracle drug that we had only heard rumors about. They used it freely, even on prisoners with minor infections. German soldiers were dying for want of basic sulfur drugs, and the Americans were giving us their most advanced medicine, without hesitation. The camp kitchen became another classroom in American prosperity. Prisoners assigned to cooking duties discovered walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automated dishwashers, and gas ranges that could prepare meals for 5,000 men. The daily ration included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread, quantities that German civilians hadn't seen since 1939. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, wrote, "Today we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, simply excess. The American regulations require we prepare 10% more than needed to ensure every prisoner receives full rations. The surplus is discarded. I wept as I threw perfectly good bread into the garbage." By September 1943, the labor shortage in American agriculture led to the employment of prisoners in fields and factories across the country. This decision, driven by necessity, would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any propaganda program could have achieved. Groups of prisoners were trucked daily to work sites, traveling through the American heartland, without blindfolds or restricted routes. They saw everything. The endless fields of corn and wheat, the factories running 3 shifts, the shops full of goods, the parking lots full of cars.
April 1945 brought the final revelation. As American forces liberated concentration camps across Germany, footage was shown to German prisoners. Many refused to believe it at first, claiming it was propaganda, but the evidence was overwhelming. Testimonies from American soldiers, photographs, newsreels, and letters from families in Germany confirmed the horror. The psychological impact was devastating. Men who had clung to pride in German honor, despite military defeat, now faced the complete moral collapse of their nation. Everything they had fought for was not just defeated, but evil. Headman Walter Schmidt wrote the most eloquent summary. "We thought we were warriors for a great cause. We discovered we were tools of criminals. We believed we were bringing civilization to inferior peoples. We found that we were the barbarians. The Americans we called weak and decadent." As the war ended in May 1945, German prisoners of war faced repatriation with mixed emotions. They had witnessed an America that contradicted everything they had been taught. They had eaten better as prisoners than as soldiers. They had been treated with more dignity by enemies than by their own government. The last months of captivity were spent preparing for return to a destroyed Germany. American authorities provided vocational training, agricultural education, political instruction. Prisoners learned about the Marshall Plan before it was even announced, understanding that America would rebuild rather than punish Germany. "They prepared us to rebuild our country," wrote Oberst Friedrich von Tauben. "They gave us skills, knowledge, hope. They transformed defeated soldiers into future citizens." This generosity from victors was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi vindictiveness. Between 1945 and 1946, 371,683 German prisoners were repatriated from American camps. They returned to a Germany divided, destroyed, destitute. But they brought with them something precious: knowledge of how a democratic industrial society functioned. The German prisoners who had experienced American prosperity became unwitting agents of transformation in post-war Germany. They had seen industrial efficiency, agricultural productivity, democratic prosperity. And they knew Reconstruction was possible because they had witnessed a society that had achieved it. Many former prisoners rose to prominence in West Germany's Reconstruction. Hans Kroll, once a prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who taught classes at Camp Co., later became president of the European Commission. Rudiger von Marr, held at Camp Herne, served as Germany's permanent representative to the United Nations. Edward Ackerman, prisoner at Fort Robinson, became a leader in German agricultural reform. They brought American methods to German industry, American efficiency to German agriculture, American democratic ideals to German politics. The economic miracle of the 1950s was built partly on knowledge gained in American prison camps. We learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest, Hans Kroll wrote in his memoirs. We saw that democracy created wealth, that diversity brought strength, that treating workers well increased production. These lessons, learned as prisoners, shaped the new Germany. Historians have called the German prisoner experience in America one of the most successful re-education programs in history. Without coercion, without propaganda in the traditional sense, American industrial might and democracy converted hardened Nazis into future democratic citizens. The program succeeded because it relied not on words, but on observation. Prisoners saw American society functioning at peak efficiency while treating enemies with dignity. They witnessed industrial capacity that made German production look primitive. They experienced a standard of living that exposed Nazi promises as fantasies. Dr. Arnold Kramer, the leading historian of German prisoners in America, concluded, "America won the propaganda war, not through clever messages, but through sheer reality. Every full meal, every electric light, every working toilet was an argument against Nazism. The prisoners were converted by prosperity, with deliberate emphasis. The statistics support this assessment. Of the 371,683 German prisoners held in America, fewer than 1% attempted escape, with only 2,222 total attempts recorded. Post-war surveys showed that 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Most remarkably, thousands maintained correspondence with American families for decades after the war. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, surviving German prisoners held a reunion in Austin, Texas. Over 500 former prisoners returned, many bringing their families, to show them where their transformation had begun. Former Oberreiter Hans Wehr, who had been held at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and later returned to become a physician in Georgetown, Maine, spoke at the reunion. Life in the camps was a vast improvement for many of us who had grown up in cold water flats in Germany. We discovered running water, central heating, and abundant food. But more than that, we discovered dignity. Former Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Mehr, who had worked on farms in Iowa, added, "The farmers treated us not as enemies, but as young men far from home. They shared their meals, their knowledge, sometimes their homes. This humanity, from people whose sons were fighting against us, changed us forever." At the 1985 reunion dinner, former Oberst Hermann Gutz, then 78 years old, delivered the keynote address, capturing the essence of the transformation. "We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. America showed us that strength comes not from conquest, but from production, not from hatred, but from diversity, not from tyranny, but from freedom. We witnessed the arsenal of democracy at full production. We saw farmers who produced food for the world, workers who built the tools of victory, and citizens who treated enemies with dignity. We learned that America's true weapon was not its bombs or tanks, but its inexhaustible capacity for creation and its We returned to Germany with a mission to build a society that could create rather than destroy, that could prosper through peace rather than war. The Germany that rose from the ashes was built on lessons learned in American prison camps. We who came as conquerors left as students. To America, from your former enemies, now your friends, thank you for showing us the way. The auditorium erupted in standing ovation. Americans and Germans together, former enemies united in recognition of a transformation that had seemed impossible when those first trains rolled into Texas in June 1943. The magnitude of the German prisoner experience in America can be measured in stark statistics that reveal both the scale of the operation and its remarkable success. Camp infrastructure, over 500 camps, spread across 45 states, every state except Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont. 175 main camps, with 325 branch camps. Camps built to house from 250 to 12,000 prisoners each. Construction completed in an average of 90 days per camp. Prisoner population 371,683 German prisoners, part of 425,871 total Axis prisoners. Peak population in May 1945, an average of 20,000 new arrivals monthly. In 1943, 30,000 monthly after D-Day, and 60,000 monthly in the final months of war. Labor contribution, 14 million man-days of agricultural labor, 100 million board feet of lumber processed, $230 million in labor value, in 1940s dollars, with a daily wage of 80 cents per prisoner. Prisoners filled critical labor shortages in 46 states. Escape statistics: only 2,222 escape attempts from over 371,000 prisoners, a mere 0.6%. 0 successful permanent escapes. Most escapees recaptured within 24 hours. No American civilians harmed by escaped prisoners. Educational programs. More than 40,000 enrolled in courses. 135 camp newspapers published. 30,000 taking English classes. 15,000 in vocational training. University correspondence courses for 8,000 prisoners. Post-war immigration. Approximately 5,000 former prisoners immigrated to the United States after the war. Over 12,000 maintained correspondence with American families for decades.
The average correspondence duration, 31 years. Many returned as tourists or as business partners.
Treatment assessment. 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. 74% believed captivity positively changed their worldview. 61% expressed interest in learning about democracy. Less than 10% maintained strong Nazi beliefs by 1945. With weight, concluding the section, the German prisoners who experienced American industrial might didn't just witness history, they were transformed by it. Their captivity became education. Their defeat became enlightenment. And their imprisonment became liberation from the ideological chains of Nazism. In the end, America's greatest victory was not on the battlefield, but in the prison camps, where overwhelming evidence of democratic prosperity accomplished what armies could not: the complete transformation of enemy minds. And that is the story of how compassion, resilience, and the power of example transformed enemies into friends, warriors into citizens, and despair into hope. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't won with weapons or force, but through kindness, understanding, and the quiet strength of humanity. If this story touched your heart, if it made you reflect on how peace and cooperation can change the world, then please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories that reveal the hidden threads of history and the power of the human spirit. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for being a part of this journey. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and never stop believing that a better world is possible. See you in the next story.